This week on the Wheelhouse. Project 2025. A plan some politicians say is dead on arrival. But is it dead? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. In the month of June, we put out a survey asking listeners to weigh in on the issues they care about most this election season. What an outpouring of responses. More than 750 people, 750 of you shared what's on your minds. One thing people wanted to talk about, Project 2025. We're going to talk about that later in the show, but first, we're going to dig into some local news. Connecticut holding primary elections on Tuesday, including nominating contests for the Republican Party in the race for U.S. Senate and a U.S. House seat. Connecticut Public's state government reporter, Michaela Savitt, has been following this. Hey, Michaela, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much, Frankie. Good morning.
So happy to hear from you this morning. Two key GOP primaries yesterday with Republican challengers vying to take on U.S. Senator Chris Murphy and 4th District U.S. Congressman Jim Himes this November. Michaela, who won?
Yeah, so Republican voters across the whole state of Connecticut could vote in this GOP primary for U.S. Senate, and there were two candidates, Matthew Corey, a Navy veteran and small business owner, and Jerry Smith, the first selectman of Beacon Falls, who got the GOP endorsement. Matthew Corey won, according to the Associated Press, and he will now challenge incumbent Democrat Chris Murphy, who has held this seat for a decade and is the heavy favorite to win in November. And that second race you were talking about is over in Fairfield County, where there was another two-way Republican primary for Congress. Bob McGuffey, the party-endorsed candidate who led Senator Ted Cruz's 2016 presidential primary campaign in Connecticut, versus Michael Goldstein, who is a physician. Goldstein won that race, and this fall he will face off against incumbent Representative Jim Himes, who's a Democrat and has held his seat since 2008.
888-720-9677, the number to call if you want to talk to us today about any of the races, anything like that. Hey, these were the first summer primaries, Michaela, that were held since the state implemented in-person early voting. Did you hear anything remarkable about voters' experiences with early voting during these primaries?
Yeah, the rollout versus turnout is notable here. As of this year, just a reminder, early and in-person voting is required by Connecticut law in every municipality, and this is the second time it was held. 7 days were mandated for the August primary versus the 14 days for the upcoming November general election. So towns are required to staff the days in each location. We've been hearing is several were unhappy with long hours, a lot of towns only having a small number of residents showing up to vote early. And low turnout was expected for the August primary. The preliminary early voting numbers show that, with only about 8,700 early ballots being cast out of the 1.2 million registered Democrats and Republicans. And those early turnout numbers could mean some changes are coming to early voting. Yesterday morning, Secretary Thomas spoke to a number of reporters, including myself, and said it might be time for the legislature to adjust how long early voting goes on. So ultimately, changes to the number of days are up to our state lawmakers, and they'll reconvene again this January.
One place where early voting turnout was sort of higher was Hamden, where you visited. What were people saying there?
Yeah, turnout was a lot higher in Hamden, actually. I went during their Thursday early voting extended hours in the evening, and they were also feeling the impact of the long week and the longer hours. But they had over 1,300 ballots, which was the biggest in the state, a huge slice of the total votes, which again were 8,700 for early voting in person. And election officials credited strong informational campaigns sent out by mail. And these informational campaigns could be coming to towns in Connecticut. Yesterday, Secretary Thomas said her office is actually looking to print flyers for libraries statewide, advertising early voting for the upcoming general election. And just for some context, in February, her office did seek funding from lawmakers for a public education campaign, including early voting, but that requested $2.5 million was not allocated.
Very important context on the primaries from Michaela Savitt, Connecticut Public State Government reporter. Michaela, thank you so much for joining us and coming on this week's show.
Thank you, Frankie.
Thank you. We're going to be joined now by another reporter from Connecticut Public, Eddie Martinez. He covers breaking news in Fairfield County. Good morning, Eddie. A big primary down there yesterday in Fairfield County for a seat in the state's 22nd district. Candidates from Trumbull and Bridgeport. Who won that primary, Eddie?
Hi, Frankie. Yes, the AP declared Sujata Gatkar-Wilcox the winner late Tuesday night, and she got 41% of the vote compared to the runner-up, former Bridgeport Mayor Bill Finch, who got a little over 27%, I'm sorry.
Any context on Sujata's run? I know that because of name recognition alone, it might have been Bill Finch that was the favorite there.
Yeah, definitely. He had name recognition, but Sujata Gatkar-Wilcox also had recognition as well because she ran for office a couple of times over the last few years, and she's been active in the local community as well. But she also was able to get endorsements during the primary race from several officials and advocates from the American Federation of Teachers to former state representative Chris Caruso.
And a lot of work from the Trumbull Democratic Town Committee, right? She is a Trumbull resident, and Trumbull Democratic Town Committee officials were at her election night party, primary party, celebrating with her, and they've been helping to knock on doors and just spreading her campaign message to people. Eddie, you've been talking to people about civility, something we're all talking about a lot lately. How people interact with one another when politics are front of mind. The past few weeks, eventful. What are you hearing from local officials about how we are or aren't keeping things civil in our state, and how does it square with your own experience covering events in the political sphere?
It's interesting, for lack of a better word. I've spoken to New Britain Mayor Aaron Stewart a few weeks ago after the assassination attempt on former Donald Trump, and almost immediately after, she wrote and released a letter to her constituents asking local constituents to be more respectful of their political differences, especially towards immediate neighbors. Most people appreciated and liked the message that she was trying to put out, but she did tell me that she got two letters from non-residents attacking her for equating right-wing and left-wing rhetoric as the same. And she told me that she was resigned to the fact that she's always going to make someone unhappy with what she has to say, no matter what the message is.
Eddie Martinez, thank you so much for your work. Breaking news reporter here at Connecticut Public. Eddie, thank you so much for coming on this week's show.
Thank you so much.
Going to pivot now from primaries to housing. If you're listening on the radio, you wouldn't have known because I didn't tell you that I have two spectacular reporters sitting next to me in the studio to my left. First of all, Abby Brown, housing reporter for Connecticut Public. Good morning, Abby.
Good morning, Frankie.
And Ginny Monk, children's issues and housing for the Connecticut Mirror. Good morning.
Good morning.
So glad to talk to you both. If anybody wants to jump in on the conversation real quick, if they have any questions, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Ginny, you responded to the news that Joe Biden was dropping out of the race a couple of weeks ago and Democrats were coalescing around Kamala Harris with a newsletter sent out by the Connecticut Mirror called Home State. You should subscribe if you can. In it, you outlined the challenge ahead for the vice president on housing. We talked on the show about the local housing crisis, but there's a national one too, right, Ginny?
There is. Every state is experiencing shortages in homes that are affordable and available, particularly for low-income renters. I think it's important to note here there's still a lot of specifics we don't know about the Harris campaign and sort of the policy initiatives she's going to roll out, but we can look at some of her history through politics in the housing sphere. So she made this sort of central to her 2020 campaign. She worked on a rent relief act while she was in Congress that would have eased some rent burdens on households that are paying more than a third of their income to rent. Housing has been a big issue for voters in this election. A lot of the way people experience the economy is through their day-to-day costs, and housing is really a significant cost for households.
This is a conversation we've had with folks on the show. A lot of people saying that the war in Gaza has been a big topic, or immigration, but really a lot of people are thinking that it's housing. The lack of affordable housing is maybe chief among them.
Right. I mean, I think through this election, we've talked a lot, again, about the economy, and you can talk about stock numbers and sort of how the market overall is doing. And that's, those are all important data points. But a lot of the way people think about the economy comes from their personal experience. And two of the larger costs for households, housing and childcare, have been increasing, and that feels bad.
Very important context around what we're talking about here in the election from Ginny Monk. I mentioned earlier that we put out a survey to Connecticut public listeners, and we received lots of responses about housing. One person, I know you know who this is, Amanda Gordon, wrote in asking about each presidential candidate's plans to address the growing national housing crisis. I want to dive into that a little bit. I think we talked a little bit about the vice president. Donald Trump, the former president, how did he do on housing, or at least do we know what that plan could look like here if the former president's reelected in 2024?
Sure. So again, we can look at his past policy positions. He has in the past proposed big cuts to HUD, the country's federal housing agency. He rolled back some of the fair housing enforcement rules and has argued against, I think this is notable for Connecticut, state level control of zoning. So he's very in favor of local control of zoning. This time around, he's sort of centering his housing positions on cutting down mortgage costs, on inflation, so a little more geared toward home ownership.
Another listener, Jessica Wright, this is for you, Abby. Good morning. Shared her worries that housing stability continues to be an issue for residents in Connecticut. Jessica wrote that this is true particularly for those facing legal challenges related to eviction and property maintenance. Have you heard similar worries when you're talking to people in your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, Connecticut doesn't have great protections for renters. There is a law against no-fault evictions, also known as lapse of time evictions, when people are being forced to leave their homes, not by anything that they did. Their landlord just decides, we want to boost the rent, or we decided we just don't want to continue your lease. But those protections are really only for people with disabilities and elderly folks. There's been a push in recent years, multiple times, to try and get those protections expanded to everyone. It hasn't happened yet. There are protections, of course, against retaliatory evictions, but those can be really hard to prove, and often they just kind of slip by as no-fault evictions.
Connecticut Public recently produced a housing documentary called Fighting for Home, How Housing Policy Keeps Connecticut Segregated. Folks can watch that at ctpublic.org. Abby, the doc covers exclusionary zoning and redlining, racism, classism, basically the systems that have contributed to the crisis we have today. Ginny talked a little bit about local control and zoning. This is what we all are living in an era of, this local control. How is it affecting the people that you talk to? Do you have any anecdotes that you could share?
Yeah, zoning is kind of at the heart of everything when it comes to housing. It all comes back to zoning. It is related to the rise in homelessness. I've spoken with homeless service providers that have said, yes, it all comes back to zoning. The rise in homelessness is because people can't afford homes. And a lot of the time, people can't afford homes in the towns and communities in which they live because there isn't enough affordable housing, because the zoning boards aren't approving affordable housing. And there's little stipulations in the zoning codes that are preventing affordable housing from being approved. It's a little more insidious and subtle than just looking at a map and seeing redlining. In some places it is like that. You can kind of see the difference in neighborhood to neighborhood. But it's often a little more secretive. There's particularly it's an issue in Fairfield County, where 3 or so cities will take the brunt of all of the low income renters looking for places to live because they are more generous with their zoning and permit more multifamily and low income housing. But it's a very big issue.
So let me take this giant grenade I just happened upon and just throw it right at Ginny and hope that she could catch it. Are there any plans to address that next year in the legislative session?
Yeah, so I think we can expect to see a couple of measures come up. One would be fair share, which is something that's come up the past few years and has drawn a lot of attention, particularly the past couple legislative sessions. That is one that would divide up the housing need among towns and sort of assign each town a number of units that they would need to plan and zone for. I think it's likely we'll see the work, live, ride, pushing for more housing density near train and bus stations in the next session. And then I think as well, we'll likely see more pushes for tenant protections from the tenant union groups, possibly the eviction protections that Abby mentioned.
Anything to add based on any talks you've had or anything like that at least people might want to see covered in that next session, Abby?
One thing that I am curious about, I haven't heard any discussion about this being brought up specifically in the upcoming session, but I have had conversations with homeless service providers and housing providers about this. The Supreme Court recently made this ruling that effectively allows local towns and cities to create ordinances making it illegal to sleep outside. So they're kind of homeless service providers are framing it as effectively criminalizing homelessness. And so there hasn't been any ordinances proposed or passed in Connecticut looking to criminalize sleeping outside. But I am curious if there are going to be any laws proposed to prevent that from happening to begin with. So that's something I'm keeping my eye on.
Very important that anybody that's listening to this conversation right now follows Abby Broen and Ginny Monk in their reporting next year during the legislative session. But obviously they're working on it before January as well. Two prolific housing reporters, the incredibly responsive Ginny Monk of the Connecticut Mirror and my Connecticut Public BFF over here, Abby Broen. Thank you guys for coming on this morning.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
Frankie.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We want you to shape our election coverage. What do you care about? What issues aren't being covered? Fill out our survey at ctpublic.org/elections. Survey responses from Amanda Gordon and Jessica Wright have already been featured on our show today. Maybe yours will too. Coming up after the break, another topic y'all wanted us to explore, Project 2025. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Stay tuned. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. For the rest of today's show, we're going to be diving into Project 2025. It's the controversial playbook for a right-wing presidential administration. Something a lot, and I mean a lot, of Connecticut Public listeners have been asking about in our election survey. We got questions like, what is it? Who's really behind it? Why is former President Donald Trump saying he wants nothing to do with it? To help us separate the facts from the fiction, we got two wonderful guests with me this morning. Rachel Leingang, democracy reporter for The Guardian, United States. Thank you so much, Rachel. Welcome to the Wheelhouse.
Great to be here.
Guardian US, I would imagine. I don't know why I'm saying United States. I'm being very formal. I apologize. You could give me the official title, Rachel, so I don't butcher it.
No, that was just right. Democracy reporter for The Guardian.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And to help us understand how Project 2025 impacts us here in Connecticut, Lisa Hagen. Lisa, federal policy reporter for Connecticut Public and the Connecticut Mirror. Thank you so much for coming on today, Lisa.
Hey, Frankie, great to be back.
Folks want to join the conversation, 888-720-9677. I promise this is an important topic. Again, one of the top issues that people wanted to talk about. We had like 750 responses, and you could imagine this was a lion's share of the responses, so I don't know what that means, but a higher percentage of the other ones. Rachel, let's start off with some basics. What is Project 2025?
First, I love that you guys asked your audience about this, and I'm not surprised to hear people have a lot of questions since it's something that you just hear the term a lot and not really the understanding of what it is, like if you hear something like housing or costs and things like that. Project 2025 is basically a four-pronged approach put together by a bunch of conservative groups led by the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank, a conservative think tank based in DC. The thing that's gotten the most attention so far is one of the prongs is a 900 plus page kind of policy manifesto that goes, piece by piece through each federal agency and suggests different policies or ways to dismantle what exists there and realign it with the conservative movement. The other pieces are about like recruiting personnel, with the idea that personnel is policy. So recruiting the next conservative leaders who will staff the government if a conservative wins again. And then another piece that is not public would be like a transition plan, a playbook to put all of these ideas into practice should Trump win in November.
When did this first come to light? When was this first introduced? Or not necessarily when did it first come to light, but when was it first introduced? I think that's a better question.
I believe in 2023 is when it was put out. So it's been out for quite a while. It really kind of caught fire and became like a public consciousness issue, I would say, at the beginning of this year as the election heated up.
And why? That's where I wanted to kind of get to. Was it like people were seeing it on social media? I didn't see it much before we did our survey, to be honest with you. And that probably says more about me than it says about Project 2025.
Well, it's one of those things where I think the conservatives were talking about it because they all worked together to put this, many of them worked together to put this together over the course of several years. So this was like a thing that they were working on. But I think once people on the left started seeing it, and then groups on the left, like nonprofits or advocacy groups, started reading it and then putting out, infographics or social media videos, and then it kind of takes off. And then now it's a very mainstream Democratic talking point about, kind of telegraphing the dangers if Trump wins again. And it's sort of become a shorthand for, that idea of what Trump could do in office.
Tom from Manchester has a call for us this morning, has a comment on Project 2025. He called 888-720-9677. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, good morning. On the Project 2025, I just feel as a person of color that there's just too much anti-immigrant backlash, especially south of the border. If you're a person of color, and also with DEI going to make anything against diversity in colleges, I don't know if we'll get down to the schools and private sector, whereas it's supposed to be un-American, or as Mr. Trump says, too much anti-white racism and all that, which I think is crap, because as a African American male, I've been called, racial slur names in the past, and you could, pick up on it that we're in partisan politics. There's got to be a white person in charge again. Pardon my, English, but I feel like we're going backwards 65 years because of his ideology. Because of Ms. Kamala Harris, she's been called names, and a presidential candidate and others, or who's black enough, or if you're conservative of color, I wish they could speak out on that rather than stay silent and march along as a fuck up for Trump. So that's all I would have to say.
I appreciate your perspective so much this morning, Tom. Thank you so much for calling in. We hope you'll call in again soon.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to transition from Tom to say there's a lot of rhetoric that people are pulling out regarding diversity, as he said, and I guess trying to make sure that not only that government is probably populated with loyalists, but also people that are not necessarily looking at diversity when they're trying to populate government. And I'll actually throw that question to Rachel. I apologize for not shifting.
Yeah. So I've read the whole thing. So each chapter, I would say most agencies, if they have any kind of program related to recruitment of diverse candidates, or other like trainings related to diversity, equity, or inclusion, it says to explicitly dismantle those. Like pretty much every chapter has some element of getting rid of that. And throughout They talk about getting rid of like the quote unquote woke in government, and that's one of the examples that they use. Um, and then the caller also mentioned immigration. This is also something where like the project and Trump align on immigration. So mass deportations is part of the goal, stricter border control, obviously, but then also stricter usage of visas. I would say like Trump has been very explicit that he wants a lot of changes to immigration. The project itself has a lot of details on what that could look like. Trump himself has maybe not weighed in on each and everything.
I want to jump in one bit there because I think you really helped us understand that there is rhetoric in this Project 2025, which people are saying that, they're kind of distancing themselves from, at least they're trying to. Help me with the rhetoric on immigration. Are you seeing explicit rhetoric on immigration in Project 2025?
Oh, yeah, there's a ton. There's entire agencies where when it deals with immigration that talks about like what exactly they could do. In our reporting, we've been really clear on trying to delineate what Trump has said on an issue alongside what Project 2025 says, because they aren't coming from the same source, but they sometimes have the same ideas. Some of the ideas in Project 2025, they want to limit like usage of visas for mostly high wage specialty workers. So limiting the use of any other visa programs, blocking federal financial aid for college students who maybe are undocumented, including dreamers. If you live, it goes, very minute details. If you live in a federal housing or receive money for a federal housing program and someone in your home is undocumented, you wouldn't be able to use that money. So you can have an undocumented parent, child, roommate, any of those sorts of things. So like the details it gets into are fairly granular in a way that like a Trump stump speech is not getting into like those nitty-gritty details.
Lisa Hagen, can you paint a picture for our listeners? What were some of the notable things proposed in this plan that at least you parsed out?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rachel hit on a lot of that, and she got really into the immigration section of it, which is a pretty notable part of the document. 900 pages. It's pretty wide ranging. And so let me try to distill out at least a few things because there really is a lot there. But
Sorry.
I mean, no, you're good. So abortion rights, I mean, that's a big one that's on the campaign trail. Nothing really on what some Republicans have weighed in on, which is, a national ban on abortion. There's not anything in there, but it really focuses on restricting the use of the abortion pill mifepristone, which has come up a lot. Obviously, the Supreme Court has weighed in on that issue, kind of restricting getting it through mail, which was extended during the pandemic. So that's a big part of it. I think climate is also a really big part of this. I mean, other than just the climate, I mean, there's so many federal agencies and departments that would shutter if Project 2025 would become a part of a future Trump administration. Climate change is one of those departments that would probably end under this. Less federal funding for research and investments in renewable energy. That's a big one. And I think schools would see a lot of changes if Project 2025 became real. It would pretty fundamentally, I think, change public education, pushes for school choice. It would end the Department of Education, which has been around since the Carter administration. So, I mean, it really touches on a lot of facets of the federal government and the way that it works.
On the reproductive rights, I know that this is really a big reason why Project 2025 is so controversial, because Republicans locally and nationally have so been trying to distance themselves from anything that has to do with taking back reproductive rights since the midterms, or at least have been trying to distance themselves from it. So has there anything that's been walked back in this document, or at least providing an impetus for other Republicans to try to run away from Project 2025?
I wouldn't say walking anything back, but they're not really going there in terms of, any kind of national changes to abortion. I mean, I think, Trump and the Republican platform that we saw was implemented in the Milwaukee Convention. I mean, they're really trying to leave it up to the states. They know this is a hot button issue. It's something that came up, as you said, a lot in the 2022 midterms. I expect it to be another huge issue this campaign cycle. And so leaving, I think, abortion to the states, and I don't think they're really going there in Project 2025.
When we talk about reproductive rights, one can construe the term family with I know this is hard to say, but hear family so much. That could be a way that we're talking about reproductive rights when we focus on the family. And that could have Christian nationalist undertones or maybe overtones. So, can you help us with that in this document, Rachel, where you're seeing that and maybe where that plays into reproductive rights, maybe LGBTQ issues?
I would say throughout, the Christian worldview and conservative Christian ideology is infused in the policies that they're suggesting. I mean, in any instance where there could be abortion mentioned, even in any kind of way tangentially, this is brought up. So when we're talking about like foreign aid to other countries, they want no mention of abortion as a healthcare or any kind of um, role in reproductive health. And then, it goes as far as wanting to rename the Department of Health and Human Services as the Department of Life. Like there are kind of throughout it's clear the worldview that it's coming from. In one section, this is not exactly related to reproductive rights, but it does suggest even like, employers, trying to have a national day off on Sundays to recognize the Sabbath. So like it's using a lot of um, things that the Christian right wants to see in their daily life, kind of putting them into a policy place, almost like a more explicit rejection of, a church and state separation, which on the right has become a much more common position to say that these two ideas shouldn't be separated.
Help us with this. I understand it's the Heritage Foundation, but who else might be involved in this? Or can we point to one person in the Heritage Foundation that's really key to this? I'm trying to hone in here because we've been paying attention a lot on the Wheelhouse, thanks to the great work of Chloe Wynn and Meg Dalton in the last year or so, of trying to figure out who's behind money, who's behind legislation. Help me understand maybe not just the Heritage Foundation, but who's kind of involved in all this.
There are more than 100 conservative groups that have played some sort of role in
Oh,
it,
wow.
and then um, and have signed on in support of its ideals. And then, each agency section has a different main author and various contributors, many of whom are tied in some way to Trump's first administration. So people who either served in roles that he appointed, or people who are his definite allies, like people who are in the movement with him. Um, in terms of who some of those conservative groups are, it's most that you can think of with very few exceptions, like a couple small exceptions there. Um, some of the funding has come from, the Christian right donor Leonard Leo, who might be a familiar name to some listeners, but um, it's to some degree, it is a near consensus on the conservative movement of where they want to see the government head. But near consensus is I'm using intentionally. There are people who obviously don't want to, align themselves with this, namely Trump at this point. But a lot of it is much more detailed than, a presidential platform will have. So when it comes down to, it might not be what Trump does on things like reproductive rights, but when it comes down to like, what does he want to do in the, you know, XYZ department's subcategory XYZ? Like he's going to probably default to whatever the conservative movement has decided is their position.
He doesn't want to be involved in this, at least publicly. You just said the former president, but he's being tied to it. You mentioned the the officials that were in his administration the first time that are involved in this. What's, I guess, the strongest tie to connect former President Donald Trump to this document?
It's a good question. I mean, the person who just stepped down, who was the leader or the director of Project 2025, his name is Paul Dans. He served in various capacities in the Trump administration and was a very strong Trump ally, still is. I think because he was the leader of the like Project 2025 group within Heritage, he might be the strongest tie. But then the president of Heritage, Kevin Roberts, also has some ties to Trump. He's spoken at Trump has spoken at Heritage events. There was recently a picture that resurfaced of Kevin Roberts and Trump on a private plane together. They know each other. This is a small world, conservative DC politics, and Heritage is a long time prominent think tank. So, there's a lot of ties there. I would say those are probably two of the bigger ones.
They know each other, and some folks, some politicians might say that the former president knows a lot about this project.
And don't believe him when he plays dumb. He knows exactly what Project 2025 will do to restrict our freedoms.
That's Minnesota Governor and Kamala Harris's vice presidential running mate, Tim Walz, speaking at a rally in Philadelphia. So I think where I'm kind of going to, I think we can kind of arrive at this conclusion together. Would you say, Rachel, that the strongest connection to 2025, Project 2025 with the former president is his policies maybe the first time around, or at least what he's planning next time? Is it more in how he's walked it and talked it?
I think that is the more important thing to look at for certain.
Yeah.
So I would say, like, we can talk about the various like people connections here, but like the point is for all of us as voters, looking at what could happen, if he wins the presidency. And what that entails then is we should look at the policy ideas that he's put out, his platform called Agenda 47, and how it aligns with what's in Project 2025, and kind of figure out where there are similarities and where there are differences. And then on things where he hasn't opined, you can look at what Project 2025 has said to get maybe a little inkling of where conservatives are on a certain issue.
Man, now you want me to go down the rabbit hole here when we're talking about Agenda 47, but you say it's similar. Could you give us a couple similarities? Because I think that's very important for people to understand, because people are saying, look at Agenda 47. It's not necessarily the same thing. But can you show us where there are similarities quickly, Rachel? I'm so sorry I'm asking you so many questions.
No, you're good. So I think Lisa had mentioned the dismantling the Department of Education. Trump has said that as well. On things like getting rid of DEI, Trump says that a lot in his stump speeches. Things that are anti-LGBTQ, like, trans students playing in girls' sports. That's something that Trump has opined on, and that Project 2025 goes into. In education, the use of more school vouchers, that using public money to attend private schools, that's something that Trump has weighed in on as well. And then, there's one story that I did that looked at in the first Trump administration, a way that he had tried to get cities and states to do what he wanted was using the threat of getting rid of federal funds to pull back. And then there's ideas like that throughout Project 2025 as well. One example being if cities and states didn't follow federal immigration laws under a conservative president, they would withhold, emergency grants like from FEMA as a way to sort of try to enforce those immigration policies.
And do you see those keywords, very important keywords, family and life? Do you see that a lot in Agenda 47, or at least alluded to?
I would say alluded to. I don't think it's necessarily the same terms that are used all the time, but I don't think Trump leans as much into a lot of the like more Christian worldview, the reproductive rights or things like that. It's just not these days a winning issue for Republicans, so he's not really leaning into that the way that some in the conservative movement are.
Lisa, have any lawmakers in Connecticut responded to Project 2025? Notably?
Yes, Democrats have, in Connecticut are doing what we see nationally, like what you played from Tim Walz. I mean, they're really using this as a wedge issue in the election. Whether or not Trump ends up winning and implementing a lot of this or not, they're saying that this would be pretty damaging for both the state of Connecticut and the country. And so we saw Senator Chris Murphy making a video specifically about Project 2025 during the Republican convention in Milwaukee last month, really kind of honing in on that, talking about what he believes it would do for democracy or how it would harm democracy. Congresswoman Johanna Hayes in the 5th District has also talked about it. She specifically pointed out the education side of it, the fact that Project 2025 would eliminate Head Start, early childhood education programs that are used by a lot of lower income families. I think there's about 5,300 families or so in Connecticut that used those programs last year. And so again, that's something that would go away if Trump decided to take something from Project 2025. So that's what we've seen the Democrats in Connecticut really try to really kind of hone in on.
We had Ben Proto, chairman of the Republican Party, on the Wheelhouse last month, asked him about Project 2025 to get a comment. He called it a media-created firestorm that has nothing to do with Republicans. So that was his comment. And now we have to go to break because we are very close to the end of the show. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Coming up, continuing our deep dive into Project 2025. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Today we're talking about Project 2025, a proposed transition plan drafted by conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, that's prompted tons of debate. Still with me, Rachel Leingang, democracy reporter for The Guardian, and Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror and the Connecticut Public. Join the conversation if you'd like, 888-720-9677. We mentioned earlier in the show, many listeners responded to our Connecticut Public survey. We heard from some listeners who are concerned about Project 2025. We're going to hear from one of them now, George Wilkinson from West Haven, Connecticut.
I'm wondering, first of all, if people really know what's in that. It's a long document, and essentially what it does is a framework for shutting down the government. So I don't know if people understand that and how serious that is.
So we talked about earlier the dismantling of the Department of Education pretty much in Agenda 47. And then in Project 2025, we're talking about more agencies, maybe all of them going away. Is that kind of what George is fearful of? Are you thinking this comment, Rachel? What are we talking about in terms of infrastructure?
My guess is he's maybe talking about Schedule F and this idea of stocking the government with more political appointees. The Schedule F is maybe what you've heard of. It was something that Trump attempted at the end of his first term in office, and it would classify a lot of roles that are now like a nonpartisan civil servant role that someone gets because of their expertise in a given area, and would make those political appointees who are then more tasked with implementing things from the conservative administration's perspective. And it would, estimates are it would change as many as 50,000 workers to be political appointees, which is a huge change from we have about 4,000 now. But then also just a massive lift in terms of how do you find all of these people and get them all installed and get them up to speed on how to work in the government. That's something that Project 2025 was trying to do, is recruit some of these people. But the concern with this change is it erodes the checks and balances that exist now within agencies when there are ideas put forth that maybe don't align with expertise, with, in some cases, where the science is, or in what would actually work on the ground. And so that would be a massive change. And to some, I think they do believe that is a dismantling of the government. And certainly, at the very least, an incredible change from what the government does and how it works now.
Another comment from one of our survey respondents, Alice Burson, who lives in Avon, Connecticut. Let's hear what Alice had to say about Project 2025.
Lincoln Project, one of their videos that they put out, was just kind of highlighted how fast everything could go, worst case scenario, and the speed with which it could be enacted is really, really scary.
Lisa, when you're hearing Democrats, particularly in Connecticut, react to this, and even nationally, is this something they're looking at, the speed to which, that's obviously why we're talking about Project 2025, because there were some things that they saw in the first Trump administration that they could really try to take advantage of here. And part of that fear is the speed to which this can all happen. Is that what lawmakers are looking at?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what Rachel was talking about, just the overhaul of the federal government that we could see, whether it be, again, changing people over from career to political appointees. But I think also the fact that the document proposes shuttering a lot of federal agencies. I don't know how fast that could happen. I imagine implementing anything like that would take quite some time. would face legal challenges. So I don't know how quickly we could see this, or again, if Trump would even implement any of these things. But again, they align on certain things like shuttering the Department of Education. It would also be closing the Department of Homeland Security, and I think putting it in a different type of border patrol agency. And again, it increases presidential power. And so that's something that we could see Trump potentially wanting to implement, is that having these agencies just go directly under him in executive branch power. So again, not sure how swiftly this could happen or what they would implement, but definitely possible in terms of overhauling federal government.
Hey, Lisa, in Tim Walz's first speech as vice president, the running mate, or at least being picked there, he mentioned Project 2025 and Trump's approach to tax policy. He says Trump sits at Mar-a-Lago figuring out how to cut taxes for the rich. And then he says he'll raise costs for middle-class Americans. He says Trump will. Is this a fair criticism of Trump and the plans laid out in Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation?
Yeah, the proposal in Project 2025 would pretty significantly change tax brackets and the tax system from how it currently is under what was implemented when Trump was first in office. And so it would go to like a two-tier tax system essentially. And so instead of seeing the multiple brackets that we have now, it would go to flat rates at 15% and 30%. And so definitely some people would see increases in their taxes potentially, but I think because you're getting rid of a lot of those brackets, it's people who are that middle to lower income who could see their taxes increase, because some of them pay under 15% currently. And then the inverse is true of those who are higher earners who pay, a decent amount more than 30%, and they could actually see their taxes cut. And then it would also propose lowering the corporate tax rate. So could see some pretty fundamental shifts in tax reform.
Any quick thoughts on that, Rachel, before we close out the show?
No, I mean, I think that was a good sum.
Any thoughts that we should be paying attention to in the last 20 to 30 seconds, Rachel, in terms of Project 2025 and the work that you guys are doing at The Guardian?
I mean, I think keep paying attention to it, even though, Trump doesn't want people to keep talking about it because it still exists. You can't get rid of a 900-page policy document. And then, I think Democrats are bringing it up as a warning, but also because it must just poll terribly internally is my guess, as it has a pretty negative connotation with voters at this point.
Thank you so much, Rachel Leingang, democracy reporter from The Guardian, and of course, Lisa Hagen, my good friend at the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. Appreciate you both so much for helping us break this down today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyon-Aiken. Our technical producer is Eugene Amatruda. Thanks to Tess Terrible for helping us in studio. Meg Dalton oversees the production of The Wheelhouse. We're also supported by Megan Fitzgerald. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.